This is the podcast for Multifaith Matters, and I am the host, John Moorhead, and we have another installment in our mini-series looking at things in relation to the release of the Pentagon UFO report. And today I'm privileged to have as a guest Professor Benjamin Zeller. And Dr. Zeller, I'm just going to read your bio here that I found, and if you want to update it or add something or whatever, we can do that. Dr. Zeller is a researcher and teacher of religion in America. He focuses on religious currents that are new or alternative, including new religions, the religious engagement with science, and one that sounds fascinating to me, especially the quasi-religious relationship people have with food, which sounds fascinating. Dr. Zeller serves as assistant professor of religion at Lake Forest College, a private liberal arts college in suburban Chicago. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of a number of books. Related to our discussion today, he's the author of Heaven's Gate, America's UFO Religion, and he's the editor of a relatively new Handbook of UFO Religions. Dr. Zeller, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I have followed your work. I've done work for years in new religious movements, and there are a handful of scholars that I find especially fascinating as their research dovetails with my own interests, and you are one of those scholars. As I said, when I was introducing the bio, the Pentagon recently released a report on UFOs, or I guess they're trying to introduce new terminology now, perhaps to move away from the stigma, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, UAPs. So your conversation today has some connection to that. On a personal note, how, out of all the things you could study and research and write about as a professor working in new religions, how did UFO religions come to be both a personal and professional interest for you?
Great question. So I suppose it actually was through Heaven's Gate, the UFO group that I wrote my book about. So to step you back in time for the viewers, listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Heaven's Gate, it was probably the most important American UFO religion. And it ended in 1997 with the mass suicide in San Diego. It was very flashy, got all of our attention at the time. They were wearing Nike sneakers. They had these purple shrouds. There was a comet overhead. It was the national news. This was in 1997. I was a college student then. So I was taking a course on millennialism and messianism. I forget what the title of the course was, but it was taught by a lovely old Jesuit fellow. And he was focusing on ancient and medieval millennialism and messianism. And here right in front of me, the Heaven's Gate mass suicides occurred. Metaphorically in front of me, I was in New York, they were in San Diego. And the media coverage, I immediately, I was reading the media coverage and I went to there's a group that had a website. They're one of the first new religions popular with a website. So I went to their website and I read their materials. And it was clear to me what I was looking at was present day millennialism and messianism. But the media coverage just sort of simply dismissed them as a bunch of crazies. And I thought, as with the hubris that only a 19-year-old or 20-year-old could have, well, obviously I can do better. So I ended up writing a term paper on the group and sort of stuck with it over time. I didn't even know you could study new religions, but I sort of fell into it. And I think I've always wanted to understand groups which are portrayed as different or crazy. I think that pathologizing them is not a good first step. Not to dismiss that, I mean, there may be people with mental illness within new religions. There may be people with mental illness outside of new religions. I mean, I don't want to dismiss that may be present, but that should not be our first step. Our first step when we encounter something which is unusual, strange, even concerning or threatening should not be to assume they're either crazy or evil, but rather to try to understand what they're about. And then, of course, after we understand it, we can decide what we feel. But that's sort of what brought me into it. So they were the first UFO group, and then I suppose I just started sort of collecting and studying more. And I fell into the study of new religious movements that way. And I've been doing it really ever since. So since 1997.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, the stigma that's often there's just this cult template. And I thought we had moved beyond it. But with, the rise of Trump, you've got at least one book out attributing that to, the old mind control paradigm. And we just want to dismiss, it seems like we want to use it as a dismissive label and concept for anybody we don't like and don't agree with, that they're just cultists, right? Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. Isn't it useful language? Because it means I don't have to take it seriously. I wrote an op-ed, sort of a little academic op-ed about this, about people using the language of cults and brainwashing to talk about Trump and Trumpism. And I should put my cards on the table and say I'm a liberal. I don't agree with Trump. However, I'm very, very critical of both liberals and conservatives who use this language of cult and brainwashing as a way to dismiss, as opposed to try to understand. It's very easy and it's very comforting to say, well, someone voted for Trump, they're part of a cult, they're brainwashed. It's much harder to try to figure out why were they doing that? Why did it make sense to them to do something which I consider abhorrent, but they consider central to their identity? I mean, when I look at a particular political movement, I might see nationalism, xenophobia, racism. How come they look at it and see something else?
Right.
And it's challenging to do that. So it's easier to say, well, they're brainwashed. And I think with religion and really anything, as you pointed out, I mean, you Google something you don't like, and chances are someone's going to call it a cult. So
Right.
it's very easy to do so. We don't have to engage it that way. We can just simply dismiss them as crazy or brainwashed. The language of drinking the Kool-Aid, which is of course a reference to Jonestown, is used in that same way, right? So if you don't like what someone's doing, well, they drank the Kool-Aid. We don't have to take seriously why they're committed to an ideology or a practice we find disturbing if we dismiss it that way. Not to say at the end of the day that I think these things are good. I mean, I did, into politics, religions. I mean, we can not like things or reject them or think they're wrong or even evil without necessarily dismissing them as a cult.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think perhaps the only other term that's used in a similar way that I see repeatedly is labeling a particular president Hitler.
Oh yeah.
And the followers Nazis. We go to there are these go-to concepts and terms, and unfortunately, they just keep coming up, and they're not very helpful, particularly in our polarized moment in American culture.
It shuts down discourse because a cult is defined as an illegitimate religion, and Hitler is defined as an illegitimate, right? So you can't. Once something is defined as a cult, there's no way to engage it in a meaningful way. Here, this is an actual sort of ethnographic note. I spent many years studying the Hare Krishnas, and I was studying a Hare Krishna community, and I'd spent, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, maybe 2 or 3, on and off visiting, and I was had a pretty good relationship with the leaders there. And at one point I said, hey, do you ever get invited to the interfaith gatherings around here? There's a lot of churches and synagogues around where we were. And I'd been there long enough where the leader was able to make a joke. He started laughing. He said, Ben, they think we're a cult. They're never going to invite us to an interfaith gathering. But that's what it is. But you don't invite a cult to an interfaith gathering, right? So they're defined as an illegitimate religion. So that's the power of the language.
Yeah, I've been involved for years in rather than interfaith, I use the term multi-faith because we're not just looking for commonalities. We're also concerned about differences and trying to navigate rather than ignore those. But doing that from a religious community with members of new religious movements, I often get stigmatized that you're legitimizing them, they're evil, they're satanic, and therefore they're the object of either shunning or evangelism or something. Make them us, and then it's okay. But to have a conversation and retain difference is simply a no-go area. So yeah, it's tough working in the field of new religious movements. Now, I found an article of yours that was really interesting, at the nexus of science and religion, UFO religions, and it was from Religion Compass. In your bio, it says that you're interested, one of your research areas is the intersection between science and religion. Some in the academy would say those two don't mix. I find this combination of interest and fascinating and important, particularly as it relates to UFO religions. Can you talk about how that comes together?
Yeah. I should say, so actually my dissertation topic many years ago, I did my PhD at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was on new religious movements in science. And I was looking at the way in which 20th century new religious movements, so really in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, were engaging science as in their intellectual work. I was less interested in the sociology of the new religions than I was in sort of the content and what were they actually saying. And one of the arguments I had there was that in the 20th century, at least, late 20th century, new religions had to engage science because science was central to our society. Science was central to our civilization. Science is central to who we are as a culture. So all the new religions I was looking at were engaging and responding to science in particular ways, but recognizing there's problems with religion and science. So all of the new religions were tweaking the relationship between religion and science. So they were looking at either redeveloping that relationship or championing one or the other or redefining one or the other. So my argument was basically that you can't be a new religion today without engaging science. It's central to who we are as a people. Now, older religions, of course, predate the rise of modern science, so they don't have to. I mean, the Catholic Church does not have to engage science, although it really ought to, given the long history. So old religions do it too. It's just new religions really have to, because if you're starting today, you can't. It's the elephant in the room. You can't ignore science and technology. And particularly, I was looking at sort of post World War II, so post bomb. You can't live in the modern atomic age and not deal with the atomic shadow. And if you've read or if you heard about Paul Boyer's book, I forget the name of the title, an historian looking at American culture post bomb, and that really shaped everything. So religion and science as a broad category, yeah, I find absolutely fascinating. I actually teach a class on it. It's one of my most popular classes. I get a lot of pre-med and sort of science-oriented students to take the class, and they come in assuming there's a conflict between religion and science. And one of the things I try to emphasize in the course is that conflict is just one way to think about the relationship. And there's many ways to think about the relationship between religion and science. It isn't always conflict. That isn't to say that conflict doesn't exist. It does, but there's other ways to engage and think about the topic as well. So for those who are familiar with Ian Barber's work, for example, Ian Barber said there's 4 main ways. There's conflict, certainly. There's independence. So Stephen Jay Gould, the famous scientist, talked about what he called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. Science, magisteria is just something you teach about. So science teaches about one set of things, religion teaches about another set of things. They're independent. And then Barber himself championed, let's see, he called it, I think integration and dialogue, sort of bring them together.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. It's a fascinating article. I'll include in the program notes a link to that article as well as your book, so folks can hopefully seek those out.
Oh yeah, Stephen Jay Gould is up online. I mean, he's I don't know the copyright status, but you can easily find it online.
Oh, okay, yeah, great. As you know, the modern UFO phenomenon typically goes back to 1947 with Kenneth Arnold seeing the skipping discs near Mount Rainier. How far does the UFO religions go? Is it an extension of the modern UFO phenomenon?
It's interesting. So when I was editing this book, you mentioned in the intro, a book I just edited came out. It's the Handbook of UFO Religion, published by Brill. I should note before anyone goes out to try to order it, it's very expensive. It's meant for libraries. It's a reference book. So if you want to read it, ask your library to order a copy. Don't drop $200 on this. Ask your library to do it. But some of the chapters in there were looking at very ancient forms of sort of thinking about religion and the sky and objects in the sky. So if we have a sort of very loose definition of a UFO as anything coming out of the sky which is unusual or unknown or can't be explained, well, I mean, sometimes people talk about Ezekiel's chariot, for example, as sort of a proto-UFO, and Ezekiel's vision is sort of a proto-UFO. There's Hindu Vimayas, I believe they're called, which are sort of flying objects associated with the deities. There was a Jewish mystic in the Middle Ages who had visions of sort of these things coming down from heaven. So you have all sorts of, well, strictly speaking, unidentified flying objects. I mean, that's what they were, but not with this sort of extraterrestrial angle, really. The extraterrestrial angle really starts in the 19th century. You have some sort of within esotericism and occultism, you start to have visions of sort of Martians and Venetians and things like that. So that's really when it starts to come together as what we would today call UFO religion. But very broadly, I suppose you could say people are looking to the sky forever. And certainly there's, if you know popular ufology, the work of like Eric von Däniken and such, claiming that all religions are basically based on UFO engagement. I mean, that's so there's a long history of those sort of claims.
Yeah, I'm a child of the 1970s, and
Sure, yeah.
I imbibed quite a bit in pop culture. I don't know how many documentaries and pseudo documentaries I saw, many times hosted by Rod Serling of
Oh yeah,
Twilight Zone fame, which for me as a Twilight Zone fan gave it gravitas.
sure.
And yeah, there was all kinds of things. It was just in the culture. I was a member of MUFON
Oh yeah.
back in the 1970s. So UFOs and the paranormal have been an area of personal interest and then later academic interest. And it's interesting to see that evolution and the UFO religions. Can you talk to some notable UFO religions, past and present? What kinds of groups are we talking about?
Sure, sure. And actually, if I could mention something else, you
Yes.
mentioned MUFON. I have a new article coming out on MUFON actually on the
Oh,
use of
okay.
religious language within MUFON, the MUFON Journal.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
the way in which MUFON, which is very secular and very scientific,
Hmm.
nevertheless, many of the people writing in the not many, some of the people writing in the journal would use this sort of language of the numinous, this language of sort of the religious experience to describe the UFOs. And I'm arguing in this forthcoming article that you really can't extricate religion from ufology. That
Mm.
under the surface, ufology is sort of imbued with sort of this quest for the transcendent and meaning. Um,
Yeah.
but
Can I ask a follow-up question in relation to that before the other question?
yeah.
Uh, it's interesting when the report came out, or when the news came out that it was going to come out, media immediately started with the polarization, either the true believers or the skeptics. It was interesting. Skeptics were, presuming they had an ability to debunk what
Mhm.
presumably the military didn't have the ability to debunk, which seemed strange to me. But the so-called true believer paradigm, we automatically fall back to that nuts and bolts, extraterrestrial visitors. But how does that then naturally almost lead to kind of the savior from the skies, that looking to it as a source of transcendence?
I mean, again, that's why I think it's hard to separate ufology from religiosity, even when it's not explicit, it's implicit, because often there is that sort of messianic millennial role of the extraterrestrial. They've come to save us. They've come to prevent a nuclear holocaust. They've come to teach us about ourselves. There's this idea that they come from on high to give us knowledge or help or something, and that, I mean, that acts like a religion. I should throw in there a couple of asterisks. I suppose it's not supernatural. So if your understanding of religion depends on the supernatural, often, I mean, that's sort of the dividing block here. But then again, faster than light travel and being able to have these technological miracles and things like that. The line between what is supernatural and just high-tech science is a thin and wavy one. Arthur C. Clarke, of course, famously, what was his quip that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Same with the miracle as well. So I think you're right to point to that sort of the way in which there's sort of a salvific role within the UFO, and it does start to look quite a bit like religion. I would agree.
Now, so now that I've given you the follow-up question to the other question I asked, I think folks will be familiar with things like Heaven's Gate.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
But what are some other prominent UFO religions of the past they may not have heard of, and what are some contemporary ones?
Sure. Well, the other main contemporary one that some of our listeners and viewers might have heard of would be the Raelian movement.
Okay.
They're primarily francophone, so they're out of France and Quebec. They're actually very similar to Heaven's Gate in terms of looking to the Bible and trying to read the Bible through the lens of ufology. So they have an entire retelling of Genesis where the God of Genesis is simply an extraterrestrial, which is the same thing Heaven's Gate did basically. So for the Raelians, the race of the extraterrestrials are called the Elohim. So if you've ever read the Bible in Hebrew or a direct translation, Elohim is a name for the divine. So whenever it says this proper name for the divine, they Raelians say, well, this is the race of space aliens. And the Jehovah is a particular one of them. So they're also like Heaven's Gate. They're sort of Christian in orientation, where they're taking the Bible and rereading it as every time you have God, just substitute space alien, you have the same basic story. Up through Revelation. I mean, so Revelation is just the end, but it's the same thing. So instead of God, it's just space aliens. So there's sort of the other big one. There's a number of active groups that channel space aliens. So their founders don't claim they're in communication with space aliens. directly like interpersonal, like face to face, but rather that space aliens, extraterrestrials are able to be channeled to enter into their consciousness, and they can speak for them. Jay-Z Knights, Romp the Movement, probably one of the most famous of those. But there's others as well. There were competing channels for the Seth movement, the Seth entity. And usually the claims are these beings are from different constellations or planets in outer space, and they bring sort of wisdom and teaching. These are diffuse movements because they usually have one channeler and a whole bunch of books, and then maybe you have book clubs, people who buy the books and talk amongst themselves, but not a social movement in this sense of like Heaven's Gate or the Raelians. You said you're a sociologist. I mean, for a sociologist, those are movements that have organizations, institutions, things you can study more easily. The channelers tend to be well, to use Rodney Stark's old model, those are the audience cults or the client cults, they're called, where there's the one central figure and they sort of publish stuff and send it out. There are older UFO religions that are still around. Arthurius and Unarius are sort of tottering but still with us. Arthurius is a British one, and Unarius is based out of California. Those were started really at the very beginning of the space age, so they're down to very few members. I would say the Raelians are the group which has the most active members. Heaven's Gate is defunct, of course.
Yes, the Raelians are a fascinating group. I did my graduate thesis on Burning Man Festival, and I had to do some participant observations. So I went out to Burning Man. It was a surreal experience in general, but one particular moment was I ran into a small encampment with members of the Raelian religious group, and they were not only enjoying the hedonistic expressionism of Burning Man Festival, but I also think they were doing a little recruiting. And I'll never forget having a conversation about Raelian religion with two topless Raelian women. So it was interesting, to say the least. But
they're known for that.
Group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're known for, I mean, in addition to their UFO stuff, they're known for giving out free condoms in the street in front of Catholic churches and things like that. They're very sex positive, sex oriented, and hedonistic, as you said.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering about the role of abduction, the phenomenon. Hasn't there been at least one UFO religion where the founder claimed that he was not as we think of abduction today, with involuntary kidnapping, forced experimentation, those kinds of things, but almost a willful scoop up and given a tour, and then higher information is imparted. So aren't these almost proto-abduction kinds of experiences in some of these UFO religions?
Yeah, well, actually, and the Raelians are a good example of that, where Rael, the founder, claimed that he was, again, abducted sort of in a nice way. He was taken aboard a UFO and given a tour. Yeah, and there are older new religions like that too. Usually, it's for most new religions, it's not physically. For most, it's astral projection or it's channeling. There's relatively few where the founder claims to have physically gotten onto a UFO and physically gone somewhere else. Yeah, I think sort of the antecedent, sort of the origin for many of these, if you go back to what is actually the 18th century, would be Emanuel Swedenborg. Like Swedenborg's visions, his were dreams, but in his dreams he went to other planets. In his dreams he was able to sort of engage. I have to look at it. I think they were Venetians, but they were extraterrestrials, not Venetians, Martians. They're one or the other. But he was able to sort of send his consciousness out of his body, and that becomes sort of the model, particularly in the 19th century. Before space flight, that was very much a standard. Once you have space flight, and it becomes possible to envision actually getting on board one of these in the mid-20th century, you start to have more of these visions of actually getting onto a UFO and sailing off. Again, Rael is probably the best example. Let's see. I think the founder of Unarius actually claimed that he got on a UFO as well. I'd have to look it up. They're relatively rare. Again, usually it's the UFO, the aliens come to them, not they go to the aliens.
Well, that's a helpful distinction. I mentioned in the as I read your bio that one of your books looked at Heaven's Gate, and it's interesting that you were in college when that happened. I vividly remember Heaven's Gate. At that time in my life, I was doing I'm sure you're familiar with the different paradigms. I was doing the evangelical counter-cult approach to religions. And so I remember walking into home, we had a website up, and I got a phone call, and it was a reporter wanting me to immediately give forth wisdom on this. And I had no idea what was going on. So I'm trying to provide commentary from this paradigm while watching the news reports that are unfolding right in front of me. And so it was a fascinating time. It was a fascinating group in that it, as a UFO religion, it combines UFO mythology with Star Trek science fiction elements, Christian apocalyptic elements. How did it come to scoop up and draw upon all these various elements to create something new?
Well, so to tell the story of Heaven's Gate, or to answer that question, to tell the story of
Yes.
Heaven's Gate, it's an astute question, because we should note that part of the media confusion was, how do you take seriously a group which seems to incorporate all this stuff? It's one thing if a group is just based on Christian prophetic tradition, you can sort of pigeonhole it, you know what it is. It's one thing if it looks like just UFOs. It's when you have both, and you have Star Trek, and you have X-Files and everything else. Well, so Heaven's Gate was founded by two people, Marshall Herff Applewhite and Bonnie Lou Nettles, and they each brought their religious interests into it. Applewhite was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and he briefly went to seminary. So he had a very sort of Christian background. He was deeply familiar with the Bible. And although he ended up reading it through the lens of the UFOs, nevertheless, sort of Christianity sort of never left the center of his vision. So when push came to shove, he would go back to the Bible. Bonnie Lou Nettles, although she had sort of a vague Christian Baptist background, in fact was more into theosophy. She was a member of the Theosophical Society of America, interested in what we would call today the New Age movement. She was a channeler, so she believed she could channel the spirits of space aliens or the deceased, and she was an astrologer. So she was part of sort of that subculture. And you put them together, and that helps explain why do you have the Bible, but also you have space aliens? Why do you have channeling? The Heaven's Gate accepted channeling as well. Partially it's from the two members, but then also it's from the two founders, also from the members. Heaven's Gate, although it was founded by two people and led by two people, actually a lot of the ideas percolated up from the membership. So Applewhite himself had no interest in science fiction. In fact, he committed the cardinal sin for sci-fi fans. I'm a sci-fi fan. The cardinal sin is he confused Star Wars and Star Trek. You never do that. And he did it because he's just not a fan. But members, because this was a group about UFOs and about cutting edge technology, he attracted a bunch of sci-fi fans into his group, and they said, "Well, this thing, your stuff you're teaching here, looks a lot like Star Trek." So one of the teachings, the central teachings of Heaven's Gate, is that they're going to go into outer space and become effectively angels. They're going to become sort of extraterrestrial angels, and they're going to work together on a crew. This is the host of heaven, basically. They're going to be sort of a crew that's going to work for the divine, and they're going to take care of planets and sort of run the affairs of the universe. And some of the sci-fi fans in the group said this looks a whole lot like Star Trek, where you have sort of a crew of a ship and they sail around and take care of the planets. So a lot of that sort of filtered up from below. And also there were fans of the X-Files and fans of Stargate, and sort of they brought their interest in sci-fi into it, and so members of the group brought that angle. It sort of ebbed and flowed. After Bonnie Lou Nettles passed away in the 80s, she was the co-founder, and Applewhite was the sole leader. I would say sort of the Christian elements became more central, and in the very end, in the last couple of years, Applewhite had this, to an outsider, it's almost a bizarre fixation on the questions of predestination. Only the son of a Presbyterian minister could be as sort of wrapped up as he was in sort of these questions of divine grace and predestination, and about whether one could resist it or not. It was basically, you could see this as a man who had read the Westminster Confession and had taken it seriously and was grappling with these questions of free will and choice and destiny. And as I said, I don't think Christianity ever really left the center of the movement. I think he was still engaging it. But that's how it ended up the way it did.
Yeah, it's a fascinating religious group to study, regardless of your opinion on UFOs. I encourage folks to seek out your book. You also edited the Handbook of UFO Religions, and as you noted, it's more of an academic volume. I would encourage folks to get it through interlibrary loan, which is what I do for a lot of the expensive stuff. What I like about it is it has a global focus. It discusses new religions focused around UFOs, and it also has an interdisciplinary approach to the subject matter. Can you tell us a little about how it came about and what you were trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, it came about because I have my UFO shelf at work where I keep getting asked to write sort of chapters and articles on UFO religion because there's relatively few of us who focus on it, and the number of books on the topic is relatively few, and they're getting pretty old. So Christopher Partridge has a great edited collection, but it's got to be 15 years old by now. Jim Lewis has a great one too, but that's got to be 20 years old by now. And there's a couple of anthropologists who have some nice collections as well. One, I'm blanking on their names, but there's at least two anthropologists who've worked on the topic. But all these books are getting a little old, and I thought, well, I keep citing these old books, and wouldn't it be great if we were able to have a new one that brought together cutting edge scholarship on not just the new groups, but new focuses on the old groups as well. So, for example, Mikhail Rothstein writes a chapter for the handbook on the Artheria Society, which is an old group, but he's taking a new approach. He's taking a ritual studies approach to it. So he brings sort of a new focus to sort of the way that ritual works within this movement. So that's really where it came from. Is I emailed sort of the 20 or 30 people I knew who were working in the subject area and said, I want to put together a book. Are you interested? What are you working on? And then I found some other folks too. I sort of emailed around, and I used social media, and there were some young scholars who were just starting off, who got engaged in the project as well. There's a younger scholar from Sweden who works on UFO from a folklorist angle. So folklorist, so he's looking at UFO folklore and the way in which ideas about UFOs and visitations and abductions spread through folklore. So that's a great new addition to the scholarship. So I'm really, really proud of it. It's the work of several years. And of course, it was during the pandemic, so everything got slowed down. So it should have been out, a year ago, but we got to it eventually.
Well, it's a great book. If I encourage folks to pick it up. Would you say, without rendering a judgment on whether or not the UFO phenomenon is real, doesn't it function as a contemporary mythology, even a religious mythology for us?
I think it does. I think there is a strong mythic element to it, and in some ways, I go back to actually the work of Carl Jung. I mean, Jung pointed out that the UFO is the modern myth, right? And I'd butcher the German if I try to say it, but that's a direct translation. The UFOs are a modern myth. And he wasn't thinking myth as in something which is fake. I mean, anyone who studies Jung knows how important he took the idea of myth. Myth is what gives meaning to our lives. And so he wasn't being dismissive. And I think it's easy, we should caution, say we don't mean myth as in dismiss it. We mean myth as in it's really important. It gives meaning. It explains. It's the symbols we live by. We live in a world defined by science and technology, but also defined by religion. I think that one of the great mistakes of 20th century scholarship was the secularization model. Our society has not secularized. We are not a secular society. Yes, if you mean it in the very strict sense of religion has less influence in government, then you can look at particular places where that's true. But as a whole, we are not a secular people. So religion is central, but so is science, so is technology. And I think UFO religions are bringing the two together.
Just one final question here in relation to kind of ending where we started here, that we had this conversation in regards to the report that the Pentagon released. With the renewed interest in UFOs, do you think that this will somehow revitalize UFO religions? What is your opinion of that?
I read the UFO report, and it's about 9 pages of nothing, I have to say. I don't think it's going to satisfy anyone in terms of answers. What it does is keep the conversation going, because what the government basically said, in my reading at least, is, yeah, there's things we can't account for, and we can't account for them. That's pretty much it. And I remember it listed 4 or 5 different possibilities. That it's terrestrially made by us, our allies. It's terrestrially made by our enemies. It's sort of radar mistakes, or it's something we don't know. So there's this catch-all we don't know.
Right.
And I think that those who are believers will seize on that sort of catch-all that we truly don't know. And if you are a believer, you're going to read this report and say, look, the government spent many, many hours and many millions of dollars trying to figure out what these were, and they couldn't answer it. And the reason they couldn't answer is they were working within one paradigm, and there's no answers within that paradigm, within the paradigm of terrestrial technology. And I think that believers are going to look to this, and it's going to support them. So yes, I think for those who are prone to belief, Um, on the other hand, I think that a lot of the impetus and the power of UFO religions, particularly in the 1990s and 1980s, was born out of the connection of ufology to conspiratorialism and the idea that there was a conspiracy to prevent the knowledge of UFOs and extraterrestrials from reaching a public audience. And those who are interested in conspiracies now have entirely different angles to look at. The rise of QAnon and sort of the way in which conspiracies have moved from the margins to the center, I think that ultimately will drive fewer people towards UFO religions. It's a different era. You know, in the 1990s, during the era of Heaven's Gate, what focused on, conspiracies came out of pop culture. They came out of the X-Files. They came out of Alien Autopsy and things like that. They weren't coming out of the White House. And we live in a different era. So I think that paradoxically, although conspiracies are more front and center to our culture, I think that because of that, they're going to filter more into politics and less into alternative religions like UFO religions. Mm-hmm. That's my guess. But
Yeah.
as they famously say, historians are not very good at predicting. So I hope I'm wrong, because I love to study these groups, and I hope there's more that pop up.
Well, one quick follow-up. I listened to an interview with Joseph Laycock, who does a lot of work in, I think he might have been a contributor to your UFO religion.
Joe did, yeah. He contributed on the evangelical response to UFO belief and UFO religion. And one of the groups he looked at was a group which I spent some time with in Roswell. What was their actual name? They're an evangelical anti-alien abduction group.
Right.
Like the formal name of the group. But they believe that the aliens are real, but that they're demonic, and that the way to prevent abduction is to invoke Christ and drive them away. So it's an interesting combination between UFO religion and sort of exorcism belief, which is what Joe does. Joe has all that work on exorcism.
Yeah, Joe was giving an interview to an Interfaith podcast on his book on the Satanic Temple.
Oh yeah.
And he just relayed a personal anecdote about a friend of his that he hadn't seen for years, who invited him to come. They were going to go to the beach or somewhere and sit and meditate and try and have kind of a contactee, a UFO experience. So I wonder if perhaps maybe the shift will be not so much the development of UFO groups and formal institutionalized kinds of religions, but more individualized appropriation of aspects of UFO religion. Any response to something like that?
I think you're entirely right, and I think Joe's entirely right. So just a few weeks ago, I happened to be visiting my parents in Colorado. We were driving down to the Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I saw in my guidebook that we were driving past the UFO Watchtower. I said, we've got to go to this. So we pulled over on the side of the road to the UFO Watchtower. And the UFO Watchtower is just that. It's a structure where you can get up and look. This beautiful place, and you can look for UFOs. But there was a garden behind it where people had left sort of objects. It was a shrine, basically, to extraterrestrial contact. And it was clear that people went there and they had left objects as part of sort of their personal spiritual identity and connecting it somehow to UFOs and ufology. I wouldn't call this formally a religion. There's no theology to it. There's no sort of formal ritualization. There's no institutions, but it's real for them. There's something about UFOs and spirituality and identity and practice, in this case, perhaps pilgrimage, that connects them all together. So yes, I think you're right. And I think part of it is also in our modern internet age, our social media age, you don't need a movement anymore. You know, in the 1970s, when a lot of new religious movements were forming, you needed a movement because you could go to a used bookstore, I suppose, and pick up a book on whatever it was, but there wasn't social media, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the ability to find other people who were fellow travelers. Today, there are. So, I mean, well, Doug Collins, I think, didn't he write that book about the online pagans, right?
Yes.
Where they were able to find each other. And that book's got to be 20 years old. Cyberhenge, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's that's different. So yeah, I think if you're into UFO spirituality, you don't have to join a group anymore. You can do it on your own.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Zeller, I appreciate you carving out the time and coming here and sharing your expertise. It's fascinating.
It was a pleasure. I should say, and I should note, many years ago, I taught a course on the undead. And I remember an article you wrote on zombies. It must be 15 years old by now, but I remember assigning that to my class. So it's a pleasure to sort of to pay you back for that, because I used that UFO article you wrote. Again, it must be a decade ago.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's always good to run into people who've run into your work. In fact, the very first book that I co-edited was with Kim Paffenroth, and it was on theology and the undead.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
So that's I used part of that book for was a first year studies class I taught on the undead many years ago, and it was we were focusing. Zombies were so big then, so we used your book. I'm trying to remember, and a couple of essays. It's so long ago I can't remember, but I remember I used your work then, so it's a pleasure to pay back in some way.
thank you so much. Again, this is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I am the host, John Moorhead, and my guest today has been Benjamin Zeller. Please check the program description and notes for the listing of his various books and articles and links to those. And you will benefit from his expertise in understanding more about UFO religions and new religious movements. Again, thanks to everyone who's watching and listening. Until the next episode.